Hashtag the hook. Sometimes the most profound moments of human character are revealed not in grand gestures, but in quiet choices made when no one is watching. In a world where trust has become a rare commodity, where prejudice often clouds judgment, and where assumptions about people based on their background can destroy relationships before they even begin, one man's desperate test would expose truths that would change everything he believed about honor, integrity, and the human heart. What happens when a wealthy businessman, haunted by past betrayals and drowning in suspicion, decides to set a trap that could either validate his worst fears or shatter his deepest prejudices? What occurs when an underprivileged woman, struggling to support her family while maintaining her dignity in the face of subtle discrimination, suddenly finds herself faced with a choice that could change her life forever? This is not just a story about money left in an open safe. This is a story about the invisible barriers we build between ourselves and others, the assumptions we make about character based on circumstance, and the extraordinary power of integrity to transform even the most hardened hearts. It's about discovering that sometimes the very people we judge most harshly are the ones who possess the greatest moral strength. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about trust, dignity, and the true measure of a person's worth. Because what happened next didn't just stun one man. It revealed a truth about human nature that will leave you questioning your own assumptions about the world around you. Marcus Wellington had built his fortune through careful calculation and an almost paranoid attention to detail. At 52, he owned a chain of successful restaurants across the state, 3 luxury cars, and a mansion that overlooked the city's most exclusive neighborhood. But success had come at a cost that went far beyond money. Years of business dealings with people who smiled to his face while plotting behind his back had left him with a heart wrapped in steel and suspicions that ran deeper than the foundation of his marble-floored home. The betrayal that had shaped him most profoundly happened 15 years earlier when his business partner and closest friend, David Chun, had embezzled nearly $2 million from their first restaurant venture. David had been more than a partner. He had been Marcus's college roommate, best man at his wedding, and godfather to his daughter. The discovery of David's theft hadn't just cost Marcus money. It had cost him his ability to trust completely. Since then, every employee, every contractor, every person who entered his personal space was viewed through a lens of deep skepticism. This cynical worldview had been further reinforced by a series of smaller betrayals over the years. There was the accountant who had inflated expenses to skim money, the head chef who had sold his secret recipes to competitors, and the personal assistant who had leaked confidential information to business rivals. Each incident had added another layer of protective armor around Marcus's heart, until he found himself unable to see people as anything more than potential threats to his security and success. The morning that would change everything started like any other Tuesday in October. Marcus stood in his mahogany-paneled home office, reviewing quarterly reports while sipping his usual black coffee from bone china that cost more than most people earned in a week. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, autumn leaves danced across his perfectly manicured lawn, but he barely noticed their beauty. His mind was focused entirely on numbers, margins, and the constant vigilance required to protect what he had built. It was then that he heard the gentle knock on his office door. "Come in," he called, not looking up from his papers. The door opened with the soft whisper of expensive hinges, and Grace Robinson entered carrying a silver tray with fresh coffee and the morning mail. Grace had been working for Marcus for 3 months, and in that time, she had proven to be everything her employment agency had promised: punctual, thorough, and unobtrusive. At 41, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the simple uniform that marked her position in the household hierarchy. Her dark skin bore the subtle lines that spoke of long days and heavy responsibilities, but her eyes held a warmth that seemed immune to the coldness she encountered in her daily work. What Marcus didn't know about Grace could fill volumes. He knew she lived in the East End, the city's most economically challenged neighborhood, and that she had worked for several other wealthy families before coming to his household. He knew she was reliable and efficient, never missing a day and completing every task with meticulous care. But he didn't know about her son Jerome, a brilliant 17-year-old who spent his evenings hunched over textbooks at their tiny kitchen table, determined to earn a scholarship to engineering school. He didn't know about her mother, whose medical bills consumed most of Grace's modest paycheck, or about the nights when Grace fell asleep in a chair beside the woman who had raised her, watching over her labored breathing with a devotion that would have impressed even Marcus's hardened heart. "Your coffee, Mr. Wellington," Grace said softly, placing the tray on the corner of his massive desk with practiced precision. Her movements were economical and purposeful, betraying years of experience in homes where servants were expected to be invisible. Marcus looked up briefly, his blue eyes taking in her appearance with the same analytical precision he applied to everything else in his life. Grace's uniform was immaculate despite being several years old. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her expression was pleasantly neutral. She looked exactly like what he expected from domestic help: competent, deferential, and forgettable. "Thank you," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold, merely professional. He had learned long ago not to develop personal relationships with his employees. It only made the inevitable disappointments more painful. As Grace turned to leave, Marcus's attention was drawn to the morning newspaper she had placed on the tray. The headline screamed about another political scandal involving misappropriated funds, but it was a smaller story below the fold that caught his eye. Local woman arrested for theft from employer's home. The article detailed how a housekeeper had been caught stealing jewelry and cash from the family she had worked for over 2 years. The employer was quoted as saying, "You think you know someone, but you never really do. She seemed so trustworthy." The words hit Marcus with unexpected force, stirring up the familiar cocktail of anger and hurt that accompanied any reminder of his past betrayals. As he read further, he learned that the housekeeper had a sick child and mounting medical bills, circumstances that her employer claimed made her theft even more calculated and manipulative. For the rest of the morning, Marcus found himself unable to focus on his work. The newspaper article had awakened something dark and restless in his mind, a need to know where he truly stood with the people in his life. He thought about Grace, moving quietly through his house, handling his possessions, having access to his private spaces. How well did he really know her? How could he be sure that she wasn't already planning her own betrayal, waiting for the perfect opportunity to prove that his cynicism was justified? By lunchtime, an idea had begun to form in Marcus's mind. It was a test, really, a way to finally answer the question that haunted all his relationships. Could anyone be trusted completely? The more he thought about it, the more necessary it seemed. After all, wasn't it better to know the truth about someone's character before it was too late to protect himself? Marcus spent the afternoon researching Grace's background more thoroughly than he had before hiring her. He called the employment agency, reviewed her references, and even drove through the East End neighborhood where she lived. The small, rundown houses with their chain-link fences and tired-looking cars confirmed what he already knew about her economic circumstances. She lived paycheck to paycheck, probably struggled to make ends meet, and would undoubtedly be tempted by easy money if the opportunity presented itself. The more Marcus learned, the more convinced he became that his test was not only justified, but necessary. Grace Robinson was exactly the type of person who would rationalize theft as survival, who would take advantage of his trust, and then disappear when confronted with the evidence. He had seen it before, and he would see it again. The only question was whether he would be prepared for it this time. That evening, as Grace prepared to leave for the day, Marcus watched her from his office window. She walked to the bus stop with the same measured pace she used inside his house, neither hurried nor slow, carrying herself with a dignity that seemed incongruous with her circumstances. For a moment, he felt a flicker of something that might have been doubt about his plan. But then, he remembered David's face on the day the embezzlement was discovered, the shock and hurt in his expression that had seemed so genuine until the evidence proved otherwise. No, Marcus told himself firmly. Grace Robinson was no different from anyone else. Give her the opportunity, and she would prove that his worst assumptions about human nature were correct. The only question was how long it would take for her true character to reveal itself. As he watched Grace disappear into the gathering darkness, Marcus' Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only comes with autumn's embrace. Marcus woke earlier than usual, his mind immediately focusing on the test he had planned. As he showered and dressed in his customary charcoal suit, he felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that accompanied any situation where he might be proven right about humanity's fundamental selfishness. Part of him hoped he was wrong about Grace, but a larger part was already preparing for the inevitable disappointment. Grace arrived at exactly 7:30, as she had every morning for the past 3 months. Marcus heard her key turn in the service entrance, followed by the soft sounds of her beginning the daily routine that had become as predictable as sunrise. First, she would check the kitchen for any dishes from the previous evening, then prepare fresh coffee, and, finally, begin the careful process of cleaning the main floor of the house. From his office window, Marcus watched her move through the kitchen with the same efficient grace that had impressed him when she first started working for him. She handled his expensive appliances with respect, but not reverence, treating them as tools to be used rather than treasures to be coveted. For a moment, he wondered what thoughts occupied her mind as she went about her work. Did she calculate the value of everything she touched? Did she wonder what it would be like to own such luxuries? Or was she thinking about something else entirely, something from her own life that he knew nothing about? The moment Marcus had been waiting for came at 10:15. His cell phone rang with a call from his restaurant manager, reporting a problem with the morning food delivery that required his immediate attention. It was exactly the kind of crisis that would normally keep him on the phone for at least 30 minutes, and he had planned for this possibility. Before leaving his office to take the call in the privacy of his bedroom, Marcus opened his wall safe and removed $5,000 in cash, arranging the bills in neat stacks on top of his desk where they would be clearly visible to anyone entering the room. The safe itself was a monument to Marcus's suspicious nature. Hidden behind a reproduction of Monet's Water Lilies, it contained not just cash, but also important documents, rare coins, and several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to his late wife. The painting was operated by a sophisticated mechanism that responded to a specific sequence of touches, making it nearly impossible for anyone to discover by accident. Yet today, Marcus left it standing wide open, the morning light illuminating its interior and making the cash on his desk seem even more prominent. As he spoke with his restaurant manager about the delivery crisis, Marcus positioned himself in his bedroom, where he could see down the hallway toward his office. The call progressed exactly as he had expected, with the manager explaining that their primary supplier had experienced a refrigeration failure and that several backup suppliers would need to be contacted to ensure that all 3 restaurants could open for lunch service. Marcus found himself only half listening to the conversation, his attention focused instead on the sounds coming from downstairs. He could hear Grace's footsteps moving through the dining room as she dusted the antique furniture, the soft whisper of cloth against wood creating a rhythm that seemed to match his accelerating heartbeat. Any moment now, she would finish with the dining room and move on to his office, where she would discover the open safe and the money waiting like bait in a trap. 23 minutes into the phone call, Marcus heard what he had been waiting for, the soft knock on his office door, followed by Grace's voice calling, "Mr. Wellington? I need to clean your office when you have a moment. I'll be down in just a few minutes." Marcus called back, his voice carefully modulated to sound natural despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Go ahead and start. I'll step out when you need to vacuum." Marcus ended his phone call quickly, cutting off his manager mid-sentence with a promise to call back within the hour. Moving as quietly as possible, he positioned himself at the top of the stairs where he could observe his office through the partially open door. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Grace stood in the doorway of his office, her cleaning supplies forgotten on the floor beside her. Her eyes were fixed on the open safe, and the money spread across his desk, her expression a mixture of shock and something else that Marcus couldn't quite identify. For a long moment, she didn't move at all, as if the sight had frozen her in place. Then, slowly, Grace stepped into the office. Marcus's heart pounded as he watched her approach his desk, every prejudice and assumption he had ever harbored about human nature seeming to crystallize in this single moment. This was it. This was when she would reveal her true character, when she would prove that his cynicism was justified, and that trust was nothing more than a luxury he couldn't afford. But Grace didn't reach for the money. Instead, She stood beside the desk for nearly a minute, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were praying. Her face showed a struggle that Marcus recognized from his own life. The battle between desperate need and moral conviction that played out in the hearts of people everywhere, every day. Marcus watched as Grace slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell phone. For a moment, he thought she might be calling someone to report what she had found. But then, he realized she was simply checking the time. She stood there for another moment, looking at the money with an expression that seemed to contain equal parts longing and resolve. What happened next would be burned into Marcus's memory forever. Instead of taking the money, Grace began to look around the office with the methodical attention of someone conducting a security assessment. She checked the windows to ensure they were locked, examined the office door to confirm it was secure, and even tested the handle of the French doors that led to the garden. It was only then that Marcus realized what she was doing. Grace was trying to protect his money, not steal it. Moving with the same careful precision she brought to all her work, Grace began to arrange the cash into neater stacks, handling each bill with a reverence that spoke of someone who understood its true value. She didn't count it, didn't examine it closely, but simply organized it in a way that would make it less conspicuous from the doorway. Then, after looking around the office one more time, she pulled out her phone again and began typing what appeared to be a text message. Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. With hands that trembled slightly, he pulled it out and read the message that would shatter every assumption he had made about Grace Robinson. Mr. Wellington, I found your office safe open and money on your desk. I've secured the office and wanted you to know right away. I'll wait outside until you can come down. Grace, for several seconds, Marcus stared at the message, reading it again and again as if the words might change with repeated viewing. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. Grace was supposed to take the money, or at least be tempted by it. She was supposed to prove that his cynical view of human nature was correct, that people were fundamentally selfish creatures who would betray trust when given the opportunity. Instead, she had done something that Marcus couldn't have predicted in his wildest dreams. She had protected him from his own carelessness and alerted him to a security risk that could have cost him far more than the $5,000 he had used as bait. From his position at the top of the stairs, Marcus watched as Grace quietly left his office, pulling the door closed behind her and positioning herself in the hallway where she could keep watch over the room. She didn't pace or fidget or show any signs of the nervous energy that might have accompanied a guilty conscience. Instead, she stood with the same calm dignity she brought to everything else, waiting patiently for him to respond to her message. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. Every cynical assumption he had made about Grace, every prejudice he had harbored about people from her background and economic circumstances, had just been proven spectacularly wrong. She had been alone with more money than she probably earned in 3 months, and instead of taking it, she had protected it and reported it immediately. But even as Marcus felt the first stirrings of shame about his test, another part of his mind was already working to rationalize what he had witnessed. Perhaps Grace was simply being cautious, waiting for a better opportunity when she could be certain of not being caught. Maybe she suspected that this was some kind of test, and was playing along until she could figure out how to beat it. After all, weren't the most successful thieves the ones who were patient enough to wait for the perfect moment? These thoughts warred with the evidence of his own eyes as Marcus slowly descended the stairs. Grace heard his approach and turned to face him, her expression showing neither guilt nor calculation, only genuine concern for his well-being and security. The rest of Wednesday passed in a haze of confusion and self-examination for Marcus Wellington. He sat in his office for nearly an hour after Grace had alerted him to the security breach, staring at the money he had so carefully arranged as bait. The cash seemed to mock him now, $5,000 that had been meant to expose someone else's moral failings but had instead illuminated his own. Grace continued her work throughout the house with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown, but Marcus found himself acutely aware of her presence in a way he had never been before. Every sound of her movement, every soft footstep on his marble floors, reminded him of the moment when she had stood in his office, faced with more money than she probably saw in months, and chosen to protect rather than take. As the day wore on, Marcus attempted to return to his normal routine. He made phone calls to his restaurants, reviewed inventory reports, and answered emails from potential investors. But his concentration was shattered, his mind constantly returning to the image of Grace organizing his money with reverent care, then stepping away from it, as if it were something sacred rather than something to be seized. For the first time since David's betrayal, Marcus found himself questioning the fundamental assumptions that had guided his life. What if his cynical view of human nature was wrong? What if there really were people in the world who possessed the kind of integrity that Grace had displayed? And if that were true, what did it say about all the relationships he had avoided, all the connections he had severed before they could develop into something meaningful? The questions haunted him through lunch, which he barely touched, and into the afternoon, when he found himself making excuse after excuse to walk through areas of the house where he might encounter Grace. Each time he saw her, she greeted him with the same professional courtesy she had always shown. But now he noticed details that had escaped his attention before. He observed the gentle way she handled his late wife's china, treating each piece as if it were a treasured family heirloom rather than just another object to be cleaned. He noticed how she carefully adjusted picture frames that had been knocked slightly askew, ensuring that each one was perfectly aligned without being asked. Most importantly, he saw the way she worked around the fresh flowers that his housekeeper arranged twice weekly, never disturbing them even when they made her cleaning more difficult. These small acts of consideration and respect began to paint a picture of Grace that was completely at odds with the assumptions Marcus had made about her character. This was not someone who viewed his possessions as objects to be coveted or stolen, but rather as elements of a home that deserved to be maintained with care and dignity. By Thursday morning, Marcus found himself looking forward to Grace's arrival with an anticipation that confused him. When she appeared at exactly 7:30, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity she always displayed, he felt an overwhelming urge to apologize for the test he had subjected her to. But how could he explain his actions without revealing the depth of his prejudice and mistrust? Instead, Marcus found himself studying Grace more carefully than ever before, trying to understand the person behind the uniform. During their brief interactions, he began to notice things that painted a fuller picture of her character. When she answered her phone during a break, her voice was warm and patient as she helped what sounded like an elderly woman understand a medical insurance form. When she thought no one was looking, he saw her slip a $20 bill into an envelope that was addressed to a local children's charity. These glimpses into Grace's private life created a growing sense of shame in Marcus that he struggled to process. He had been so certain that her economic circumstances would make her susceptible to temptation, so convinced that desperation would override any moral constraints she might have. Yet everything he observed suggested that Grace's integrity was not conditional on her circumstances, but was instead an integral part of who she was as a person. The revelation became even more profound when Marcus overheard a phone conversation that Grace received on Thursday afternoon. She had stepped into the kitchen to take the call, speaking in low tones that suggested a private matter. Marcus, who had been reviewing papers in the adjacent dining room, couldn't help but overhear portions of the conversation that revealed more about Grace's life than months of casual observation. "No, Jerome, you can't take out student loans to pay for Grandma's medical bills," Grace said, her voice firm but gentle. "Your education is too important. We'll find another way to handle the medical expenses." There was a pause, and then Grace continued, "I know you want to help, baby, but your job is to focus on your studies and get into that engineering program. I've been working extra shifts when I can, and there are some assistance programs we haven't explored yet." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he listened to Grace's side of the conversation. Here was a woman who was clearly struggling financially, dealing with medical bills that she couldn't afford while trying to support her son's educational dreams. Yet when faced with $5,000 in cash, she hadn't taken a single bill. The moral strength required for such restraint, especially given her circumstances, was almost incomprehensible to someone who had spent 15 years assuming the worst about human nature. Another pause. Then, Grace's voice became softer, more vulnerable. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough for this family, if I'm strong enough to handle everything on my own. But then, I remember that integrity isn't something you can afford to lose, no matter how hard things get. It's the one thing that truly belongs to you, that no one can take away unless you give it up. These words hit Marcus like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the full weight of what he had attempted to do. He had tried to steal Grace's integrity, to corrupt her sense of self-worth for the sake of validating his own cynical worldview. The cruelty of his test became clear to him in that moment, and with it came a wave of self-loathing that was almost overwhelming. Friday brought no relief from Marcus's inner turmoil. If anything, his guilt intensified as he watched Grace go about her work with the same dedication and professionalism she had always shown. She gave no indication that she was struggling with financial pressures or family responsibilities, maintaining a serene exterior that spoke of remarkable emotional strength. During lunch on Friday, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He called Grace into his office, ostensibly to discuss her schedule for the following week, but really because he needed to find some way to address what had happened without completely exposing his own moral failings. "Grace," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She stood before his desk with the same patient attention she brought to all their interactions, waiting for him to find his words. "I wanted to thank you again for your vigilance earlier this week," Marcus finally said. "It made me realize that I haven't been as careful with security as I should be." Grace nodded once, her expression remaining professionally neutral. "It's important to protect what you've worked hard to build, Mr. Wellington. I'm just glad I was able to help." Her words carried no hint of superiority or judgment, no suggestion that she saw his carelessness as anything more than a simple oversight. The grace with which she handled even this conversation demonstrated a sophistication of character that Marcus was only beginning to appreciate. "I was wondering," Marcus continued, struggling to find the right tone, "if there's anything you need. Any way I can help make your work here easier or more comfortable." For just a moment, something flickered in Grace's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a brief glimpse of the vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and professional. "I appreciate that, Mr. Wellington. I'm very satisfied with my position here. You've always been a fair and respectful employer." Marcus felt another stab of guilt at her words. Fair and respectful were not terms that accurately described his recent behavior, even if Grace was unaware of the full extent of his test. He had been prepared to condemn her based on assumptions and prejudices, ready to use her desperate circumstances against her to validate his own damaged worldview. As Grace left his office to resume her duties, Marcus remained seated. The weekend that followed Marcus's revelation about Grace's character became a period of profound introspection that would reshape his understanding of himself and the world around him. Saturday morning found him wandering through his magnificent house, seeing it with fresh eyes that had been opened by a simple act of integrity from someone he had completely misjudged. Every room seemed to echo with the sounds of Grace's quiet presence, reminding him of her gentle care for his possessions and space. The dining room where she had dusted his antique furniture with such reverence. The kitchen where she had prepared his meals with meticulous attention to detail. The hallways where she had walked with dignity despite the uniform that marked her station in his household hierarchy. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself truly seeing his home not as a fortress against the world's betrayals, but as a space that had been touched by someone's genuine care and respect. Grace had moved through his house not as a servant or potential threat, but as a guardian of something valuable, treating his home with the same integrity she applied to every aspect of her life. On Saturday afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. He drove to the East End, to the neighborhood where Grace lived, not to spy on her as he had done before his test, but to try to understand the context of her life and the circumstances that made her integrity so remarkable. The East End was even more challenging than Marcus had remembered from his brief previous visit. The houses were small and weathered, many showing signs of deferred maintenance that spoke of families struggling to meet basic needs. Chain-link fences surrounded tiny yards where children played despite the absence of proper playground equipment, their laughter a testament to resilience in the face of economic hardship. Marcus drove slowly through the neighborhood, his expensive car drawing curious stares from residents who were unaccustomed to such obvious displays of wealth in their community. He found himself wondering which of these modest homes belonged to Grace and her family, which front door she walked through each evening after spending her days caring for his mansion. As he observed the neighborhood, Marcus began to understand something that had escaped him during his years of cynical isolation. This was a community where people looked out for each other, where neighbors shared resources and supported one another through difficult times. The very circumstances that he had assumed would make Grace susceptible to theft were actually part of a social fabric that valued mutual aid and collective responsibility. An elderly man working in a small garden caught Marcus's attention. Despite the obvious limitations of his plot, the man had created something beautiful with careful attention to detail and evident pride. Children walked by and called greetings to him, receiving warm smiles in return. It was a scene that spoke of dignity maintained despite economic challenges, of communities that created wealth through connection rather than just accumulation. The contrast with Marcus's own neighborhood was stark and illuminating. His exclusive enclave was filled with people who had everything money could buy but seemed to have no connections with one another. He realized that he didn't even know the names of most of his neighbors, despite living among them for over a decade. Wealth had bought him privacy and security, but it had also purchased isolation and disconnection from the very human bonds that gave life meaning. Sunday brought an unexpected development that would deepen Marcus's understanding of Grace's character even further. He had decided to attend church for the first time in years, partly out of a vague sense that he needed spiritual guidance to process what he was experiencing, and partly because he remembered Grace mentioning that she sang in a choir. Marcus chose a modest Baptist church in the East End, reasoning that it might be the kind of place where Grace would feel comfortable. He arrived early and took a seat in the back, hoping to observe without being noticed. The congregation was diverse, but predominantly African American, filled with families that showed the same quiet dignity he had observed in Grace. When the choir began their opening hymn, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. There, in the front row of the choir, stood Grace Robinson, transformed by the setting from the uniformed domestic worker he knew into something magnificent. Her voice soared above the others, rich and powerful, carrying the kind of spiritual depth that spoke of faith tested by hardship, but never broken. As Marcus listened to Grace sing, he began to understand the source of her extraordinary strength. This was not just someone who happened to possess integrity. This was someone whose entire worldview was grounded in principles that transcended material circumstances. Her faith provided a foundation that couldn't be shaken by financial pressure or personal hardship, creating a moral center that guided every decision she made. During the service, Marcus heard Grace's voice again when she stood to offer a prayer for community members facing various challenges. Her words were simple and heartfelt, asking for strength for those who were struggling and gratitude for those who had enough to share. There was no bitterness in her prayer, no resentment toward those who had more than she did, only a genuine concern for the welfare of others. After the service, Marcus watched from his car as Grace interacted with other congregation members. She hugged elderly people with obvious affection, helped a young mother manage 3 small children, and listened patiently as a teenager told her about his college acceptance letter. Every interaction demonstrated the same qualities that had protected Marcus's money: kindness, integrity, and genuine concern for others. It was then that Marcus witnessed something that would haunt him for days to come. As the congregation began to disperse, Grace approached a family that was obviously struggling financially. The parents looked exhausted, and their children's clothes, while clean, were clearly well-worn and too small. Without hesitation, Grace pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to the mother, engaging in a brief conversation that ended with both women in tears. Marcus recognized the envelope immediately. It was the same one he had seen Grace preparing earlier in the week, the one that had contained a $20 bill for a children's charity. But, apparently, her charitable giving extended beyond organized philanthropy to direct assistance for families in need. Here was a woman who was struggling to pay her own mother's medical bills, yet she was giving money to people whose needs were even more pressing than her own. The drive home from the East End was one of the longest of Marcus's life. Every assumption he had made about Grace, every prejudice he had harbored about people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, had been systematically destroyed by what he had observed. She wasn't just honest, she was generous. She wasn't just reliable, she was deeply committed to her community. She wasn't just dignified in the face of hardship, she was actively working to help others overcome their own challenges. Sunday evening found Marcus sitting in his home office, staring at the safe that had been the centerpiece of his test. The sophisticated security system that protected his wealth seemed suddenly absurd in the context of what he had learned about true security. Grace possessed something infinitely more valuable than anything in his safe. A sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on material possessions, relationships built on genuine caring rather than mutual advantage, and a purpose that extended far beyond personal accumulation. For the first time since David's betrayal 15 years, the crisis that would ultimately define both Marcus and Grace's characters arrived on a gray Thursday morning in late October, delivered in the form of a phone call that would change both of their lives forever. Marcus was reviewing quarterly reports when he heard Grace's phone ring in the kitchen, followed by a conversation that began in her usual calm tones, but quickly escalated to something much more urgent. "What do you mean the insurance won't cover it?" Grace's voice carried through the house with unprecedented emotion. "Dr. Martinez said the surgery was medically necessary. How can they just deny coverage like that?" Marcus found himself frozen at his desk, unable to concentrate on his work as he listened to what was clearly a devastating conversation about medical care. Grace's professional composure, which had seemed unshakable for the months she had worked for him, was cracking under the weight of what sounded like a genuine emergency. "No, I understand that you're just doing your job," Grace continued, her voice now tight with barely controlled panic. "But this is my mother's life we're talking about. There has to be something we can do, some way to appeal the decision." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Grace making increasingly desperate attempts to find a solution to what was clearly an impossible situation. When she finally ended the call, the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of crisis and despair. Marcus sat in his office for nearly 10 minutes, struggling with an internal battle that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Every instinct developed over 15 years of emotional self-protection urged him to remain uninvolved, to maintain the professional distance that had kept him safe from the complications of other people's lives. But Grace's integrity had changed something fundamental in his worldview, creating a crack in his armor that was rapidly widening into something that could no longer be ignored. When Marcus finally emerged from his office, he found Grace in the kitchen, sitting at the small table where she normally ate her lunch. Her professional composure had completely dissolved, replaced by the raw vulnerability of someone facing the unthinkable. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, immediately attempting to restore her professional demeanor despite the tears that still glistened in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wellington," she said, rising quickly from her chair. "I didn't mean to bring personal business into your home. It won't happen again." The dignity with which Grace attempted to maintain her professional boundaries, even in the midst of what was clearly a family crisis, was almost more than Marcus could bear. Here was someone whose integrity had withstood the temptation of easy money, who was now apologizing for being human in the face of genuine tragedy. "Grace," Marcus said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it, "please sit down. Tell me what's happening." For a moment, Grace seemed torn between her personal need for support and her professional instinct to maintain appropriate boundaries. The human need won out, and she sank back into her chair with the exhausted relief of someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long. "It's my mother," Grace began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She needs heart surgery, and the insurance company is saying it's experimental, that they won't cover the cost. Without the surgery, the doctors say she probably has 6 months at most." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one highlighting the stark difference between his own comfortable existence and the life-or-death struggles that Grace was facing every day. The money he had used to test her integrity could have been a mere down payment on the medical care her mother needed to survive. "How much does the surgery cost?" Marcus asked, already knowing that the answer would be devastating for someone in Grace's circumstances. $87,000, Grace replied, the number falling between them like a stone into still water. I've been trying to find a way to pay for it, applying for assistance programs, talking to charity organizations. But even if I could get some help, there's no way I can come up with that kind of money in time. Marcus felt his heart breaking as he watched Grace struggle to maintain her composure while describing what was essentially a death sentence for her mother. $87,000 was less than he spent on maintenance for his 3 luxury cars each year, an amount that represented a rounding error in his quarterly financial statements. For Grace, it might as well have been $1 billion. I keep thinking there has to be something I'm missing, Grace continued, her voice cracking with desperation. Some program I haven't found, some way to make this work. She raised me by herself after my father died, worked 3 jobs to put me through school, sacrificed everything so I could have a better life. I can't just watch her die because I don't have enough money. The raw pain in Grace's voice forced Marcus to confront the full weight of what his test had revealed. This was the woman he had assumed would steal from him given the opportunity, the person whose character he had questioned based on nothing more than her economic circumstances and his own prejudiced assumptions. She was facing the loss of her mother, drowning in medical bills that would bankrupt most families, yet she had walked away from $5,000 in cash without hesitation. Grace, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside him. I want to help. Grace looked up at him with surprise and something that might have been hope, but then immediately shook her head. Mr. Wellington, I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept charity. I've always been able to take care of my family's needs through my own work. The pride and dignity that Grace maintained even in her darkest moment was almost overwhelming for Marcus to witness. This was someone whose integrity extended far beyond simple honesty to encompass a fundamental belief in self-reliance and personal responsibility. Even facing her mother's death, Grace was reluctant to compromise the principles that had guided her entire life. It wouldn't be charity, Marcus said, an idea forming in his mind as he spoke. I've been thinking about expanding my household staff, hiring someone to help coordinate between my various properties and restaurants. The position would involve significant responsibility and travel, which would justify a substantial salary increase. Grace studied his face, trying to determine whether his offer was genuine opportunity or thinly disguised charity. Her intelligence was evident in the way she evaluated his proposal, looking for the dignity and self-respect that would make accepting help possible without compromising her principles. The position would start immediately, Marcus continued, with a signing bonus to help you transition into the new responsibilities. I think $50,000 would be appropriate for someone taking on those additional duties. For a long moment, Grace said nothing, her expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and careful evaluation. Marcus could see her mind working, trying to determine whether this offer was real and whether she could accept it with her integrity intact. What would the actual responsibilities be? Grace asked finally, her practical nature asserting itself even in the midst of crisis. Marcus spent the next hour outlining a position that was both real and substantial enough to justify the salary he was proposing. Grace would indeed coordinate between his various properties, manage scheduling for maintenance and repairs, and serve as a liaison with his restaurant managers. The work was legitimate and important, requiring exactly the kind of integrity and attention to detail that Grace had already demonstrated. By the end of their conversation, Grace had accepted the position with a gratitude that was both profound and dignified. She would maintain her pride and self-respect while gaining the means to save her mother's life. For Marcus, the arrangement provided something even more valuable, the opportunity to do something genuinely good for someone who had taught him what real character looked like. 6 months later, Grace's mother had successfully recovered from her heart surgery and was back to caring for her neighbors with the same generous spirit that had shaped her daughter's character. Jerome had received a full scholarship to engineering school, his academic achievements finally recognized by institutions that valued potential over economic circumstances. And Grace had proven herself to be every bit as capable in her expanded role as Marcus had anticipated. For Marcus, the experience had marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how he approached relationships and viewed the world. He had slowly begun to open his heart to the possibility of genuine connection, starting with small gestures of trust that gradually expanded into meaningful friendships with employees, neighbors, and even potential romantic partners. The safe in his office remained as secure as ever, but Marcus no longer felt the need to test people's integrity. Grace's example had taught him that character was not something that could be measured by artificial challenges or contrived situations. True integrity revealed itself in the daily choices people made, in how they treated others when no one was watching, and in their willingness to sacrifice their own interests for principles that transcended material gain. The morning when Marcus had left his safe open as a test had been intended to expose Grace's weaknesses and validate his cynical assumptions about human nature. Instead, it had become a mirror that reflected his own moral failures while revealing the extraordinary character of someone he had completely misjudged. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the moment that changed his life, he would tell them about Grace Robinson, a woman whose integrity had been so absolute that it transformed everyone around her. He would speak of learning that true security came not from protecting yourself against betrayal, but from surrounding yourself with people whose character was so strong that betrayal became unthinkable. And sometimes, late at night in his study, Marcus would look at the painting that concealed his safe and remember the morning when he had left it open, believing he was testing someone else's soul. It had taken him years to understand that Grace had not just passed his test. She had given him an opportunity to discover that his own character was capable of growth, that cynicism was a choice rather than an inevitable result of experience, and that sometimes the most profound transformations come from having our worst assumptions about humanity proven completely, beautifully wrong. Earlier, Marcus allowed himself to consider the possibility that he had been living his life incorrectly. His pursuit of financial security and emotional isolation had protected him from betrayal, but it had also separated him from the very experiences that made life meaningful. He had become wealthy in every way that could be measured by accountants, and poor in every way that mattered to the human spirit. Monday morning brought Grace back to his house with her usual punctuality and professionalism, but Marcus found that he could no longer see her simply as an employee. Every interaction carried new weight as he recognized the depth of character that her modest demeanor concealed. When she asked about his weekend with polite professional interest, he had to resist the urge to tell her about his visits to her neighborhood and church, about his growing understanding of who she really was. Instead, Marcus found himself paying closer attention to the small details of Grace's work, recognizing them now as expressions of her character rather than mere professional competence. The way she arranged fresh flowers in his foyer wasn't just housekeeping. It was an act of creativity that brought beauty into his sterile environment. The care with which she prepared his morning coffee wasn't just task completion. It was a small daily gift from someone who understood that dignity could be expressed through the quality of one's work. As the week progressed, Marcus found himself struggling with a growing sense of obligation. Grace's integrity had exposed his own moral failures, but it had also presented him with an opportunity to do better, to be better. The question that haunted him was what exactly he should do with this revelation. How could he honor Grace's character without patronizing her? How could he express his gratitude without revealing the manipulative test she had unknowingly passed? The answer would come from an unexpected source, in a moment of crisis that would test both of their characters in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Sometimes the universe provides opportunities for redemption, chances to prove that we have learned from our mistakes and are capable of growth. For Marcus Wellington, that opportunity was approaching faster than he could have imagined, bringing with it the chance to discover whether he possessed even a fraction of the integrity that Grace Robinson demonstrated every day of her life. Behind his desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his misjudgment, for 15 years, he had protected himself by assuming the worst about people, by maintaining emotional distance, and viewing every relationship through the lens of potential betrayal. But Grace Robinson had shattered that protective cynicism in the span of a single moment, proving that integrity could exist even in the face of desperate need. The weekend stretched ahead of Marcus like an empty desert, filled with time to contemplate the implications of what he had learned. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not just his assumptions about other people, but his entire approach to human relationships. If he had been wrong about Grace, spectacularly, completely wrong. What else might he have been wrong about? As Friday evening settled over the city, Marcus stood once again at his office window, watching Grace walk to the bus stop with her usual measured pace. But, this time, instead of seeing a potential threat to his security, he saw a woman of extraordinary character who was facing challenges he could barely imagine while maintaining a dignity that humbled him. The test was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Marcus Wellington was about to discover that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come not from getting the answers we expect, but from having our expectations completely overturned by encounters with Grace we never knew existed. "Mr. Wellington," she said as he approached, "I wanted to make sure you knew about your safe right away. I didn't touch anything except to make sure it was secure." Marcus looked into her eyes as she spoke, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw instead was something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. He saw integrity so pure and uncompromising that it seemed to illuminate everything around it. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. "I appreciate your vigilance." Grace nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed both professionalism and genuine caring. "Should I continue cleaning the rest of the house while you take care of your office?" As Marcus watched Grace walk away to resume her duties, he realized that his test had indeed revealed someone's true character. But it wasn't Grace's character that had been exposed. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus Wellington was forced to confront the possibility that his cynical worldview might be wrong, and that some people might be exactly as good as they appeared to be. The question now was what he would do with this revelation, and whether he was brave enough to examine the prejudices and assumptions that had shaped his life for so long. As he stood in the doorway of his office, looking at the money he had used as a weapon against an innocent woman's integrity, Marcus began to understand that sometimes the most profound tests are the ones we don't realize we're taking ourselves. Made his decision. Tomorrow, he would set his test in motion. He would leave his safe open with a substantial amount of cash clearly visible, create an opportunity for Grace to be alone with it, and then wait to see what happened. It was a simple plan, one that would finally give him the peace of mind that came with knowing exactly where he stood with another human being. What Marcus didn't realize was that his test would reveal far more about himself than it ever would about Grace Robinson. He was about to discover that sometimes the very act of testing someone's character reveals the true state of your own soul, and that the assumptions we make about others often say more about our own hearts than about theirs. As night fell over the city, two people prepared for sleep in very different circumstances, each unaware that the next day would change both of their lives forever. In his climate-controlled master suite, Marcus fell asleep planning a test that he believed would confirm his cynical view of human nature. Miles away, in a modest bedroom where she could hear her mother's labored breathing through thin walls, Grace Robinson fell asleep thinking about her son's college applications and wondering how she would find the money for the application fees. Neither of them knew that tomorrow would bring a confrontation with truth that would challenge everything they believed about trust, dignity, and the complex moral landscape that exists in the space between desperation and integrity.